Hello everyone, welcome to Press TV's News Review program. Now the United Kingdom has officially left the European Union in a step cast by Prime Minister Boris Johnson as the dawn of a new era. Thousands of Brexit supporters gathered outside British Parliament to celebrate the country's departure from the European Union after more than 3 years of wrangling. In a public address ahead of Brexit, Johnson promised a new era of friendly cooperation with the European Union. He acknowledged that there may be burdens ahead, but described Brexit as an opportunity for stunning success. In the pre-recorded statement, the Premier stressed that departure is not an end but a beginning. Now Britain turned its back after 47 years on the post-World War II project, which sought to unite war-racked Europe into a global power. And now joining us for this news review is Marcus Papadopoulos, publisher and editor from Politics First out of London, and Mr. James Tweedy, journalist and commentator, joining us from Plymouth. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. I guess we'll start there in London. Mark, your initial thoughts on this and the ramifications we're going to see possibly in this transition period, which starts tomorrow.
Well, after nearly 4 years since the EU referendum, Britain has finally left the European Union and is now in a transition period. And it is now that the real hard work begins, because whilst Brexit offers opportunities to the UK, for example, to devise a sensible and coherent immigration policy, Brexit also poses challenges. One of the challenges, of course, is for Britain to secure advantageous and long-term trade deals with countries around the world. That is not going to be as straightforward as Boris Johnson or indeed any other member of his government is saying that it will be, because I recently spoke with an Australian official, and this official told me that while on the one hand Australia would be keen to sign a new trade deal with Britain, on the other hand Australia views a reinvigorated Britain in Southeast Asia as a rival to Australia. So when we hear British politicians and British journalists saying that our brothers and sisters in Australia will be first in the line to sign a new trade deal with Britain, that is not giving the full picture.
And James, what do you have to add to Marcus's thoughts there, and some of your own thoughts?
Well, I think this is a moment for optimism. I mean, there is a certain amount of trepidation here in Britain among some people. There's a small minority. There's a great feeling of what you call sour grapes, let's say, about this, and a great sort of wailing and gnashing of teeth, as they say in the Bible. But I think this is finally it's happened. It's what we voted for 3.5 years ago. It should have happened almost a year ago now, but finally we are leaving. I think there's things that might be said about the nature of the European Union that we've left. I mean, we left for a variety of reasons, and mainly the people left supposed to leave because they'd seen their standard of living decline, they'd seen their jobs sent to other parts of Europe. Factories have been closed and production has been moved to Eastern and Southern Europe, where wages are lower. And we've seen, Marcus mentioned immigration there. I mean, an immigrant is someone who comes to a country and settles and applies for citizenship and lives their life there, gets married, starts a family, and so on. What we see from the EU is really migrant labor, people who come, they sojourn, for a few years, they work here for a few years, and then maybe they return to their countries. And the real immigrants in this country, who are from the former colonies, the Commonwealth countries, actually see these people as having more rights than they do, and they have, when they've, their countries essentially enriched Britain during the colonial period, and in many cases their ancestors fought for Britain in the First and Second World Wars. So, we look at what the EU has become. The EU is a cipher for imperialism. During the Cold War, it was part of the whole Cold War. It's indivisible from NATO. This is explicitly expressed in Brussels. Being in the EU means being in NATO. So it's also an organisation that's committed to military adventurism around the world. And when we get more deeply into it, what the EU represents is suppression of not just being undemocratic, but really anti-democratic, suppressing the idea of the nation state, and saying that there is no interest, that there's no such thing as national interest, there's no such thing as class interest. The only interest that one is allowed to have is the interest of capital, expressed in for freedom. So it's a kind of corporatism, which is another name for fascism.
I'm glad you spoke about money, because that's what I want to take. Marcus, okay, a free trade agreement needs to really, now it's probably possibly, you mentioned immigration. I'm pretty sure that the economy is going to probably override that. A free trade agreement, you mentioned with Australia, other countries, possibly the U.S., but the one that's really going to stick is the one that's going to be struck with the 27-nation bloc right next door. That's going to be something that has to be worked out, and you very well know if it is not. And you heard James allude to a lot of factories that have moved off into the mainland Europe, where labor you could be found for cheaper. Now, if you don't have those ties anymore, and you can't really afford the high cost of labor on British soil, what do you do if you don't strike a free trade accord with the European Union, and you have to pay taxes on top of the high cost of labor? What would that do to industry in the UK?
Well, it's certainly the case that a trade deal between Britain and the European Union will be a tough one to secure. But at the end of the day, it is in the interests of both London and Brussels to secure a trade deal, because the European Union and Britain are heavily dependent on each other when it comes to trade and also when it comes to investment. And on that basis, I have no doubt that sooner rather than later, a trade deal will be struck between Britain and the EU. We also need to take into consideration that the UK economy is one of the most powerful and one of the most robust in the world, and it has been for centuries. Indeed, the UK economy survived bankruptcy at the end of the Second World War, albeit with American loans. So I don't expect to see the UK economy fall out of the top 10 as a result of having left the EU. I do envisage short-term losses for the British economy, transitional losses, but I believe that all indicators at the moment are pointing to the UK economy being able to survive going into uncharted waters. I mean, certainly foreign investors in Britain, such as the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Indians, have not said that they fear a post-Brexit Britain. They believe that their investments in the UK will be safe, and that is absolutely crucial. But it should also be said that anyone who believes that for the ordinary Briton a golden future awaits them is either deceitful or quite simply is daft, because the European Union and Britain ultimately are two sides of the same coin. They are corporate capitalist entities, and corporate capitalism is responsible for 14 million people in Britain living in poverty, for 4 million children living below the breadline. There will be no change for people in Britain who are struggling financially as a result of Brexit. If there is to be real and meaningful change in Britain for the most vulnerable groups in this country, then something needs to be done about the system that is governing Britain, because corporate capitalism is a very brutal, inhumane and unforgiving system. And that is where the EU and Britain are on the same page as each other. They are both corporate capitalist entities. So no ordinary person in Britain should really place himself under an illusion in believing that a golden future awaits Britain. No.
And James, you know, aside from trade, we know that in the next 11 months, a lot of things have to get hammered out, like I'm sure you know, security, the airline industries, possible information technology, whatnot. My question to you, do you think the EU is going to try not make this thing a cakewalk for Britain? Because it's still, we have to go back and take a look over the last 3 years. It really wants to make a point to the other 27 remaining members.
Well, of course, that's been their whole strategy all the way through. I think at some point they may have to essentially give up on that and say, well, okay, and think about their actual interests going forward. It is obviously in their interests, in both Britain and the EU's interest, to share information on crime and terrorism, general kind of, you know, neighborly sharing of security information. You know, if the US can alert Russia to upcoming terrorist attacks, as they have done, I'm pretty sure that London and Brussels can communicate on that basis. Especially since, like I said, Britain is in NATO and pretty much every country of the EU is in NATO. So okay, there's a lot of I suppose there's a lot of kind of scaremongering about this. It shouldn't be too difficult. International aviation, I mean, air travel, these are things which are already internationally regulated, and there is no problem with air travel between the EU
you have medicine. Okay, more important than that. Okay, then let's look at fishing rights, medicine, the backstop thing. We still don't know how trade and goods are going to get through that backstop. So there are a lot of impending questions.
That's complicated. Fishing is going to be an issue because the EU wants access to our fishing grounds, you know, our territorial waters and the broader, you know, exclusive economic zone that we can claim in some of the seas around Britain. The government this is a big issue actually here. Although the fishing industry is small, it is a matter of national pride, and people within the fishing industry are very strong supporters of Brexit and actually want to see a no-deal Brexit. And the government has said that it won't move on that. It won't use that it won't allow that to be used as a bargaining chip for something else, like access for our financial services to Europe. So, yeah, there doesn't seem to be much sign that financial service companies are leaving the City of London, which would be like the fish leaving the sea and living on the land, frankly. So, yes, what are they going to say? I mean, how do you you know, there's you know, money moves around the world freely. You know, how are they going to stop that from happening?
Well, you guys are pretty much sounding optimistic about all this. I want to thank you both for joining us. Time has gotten the better of us. Marcus Papadopoulos joining us from London, and James Tootie there joining us out of Plymouth. And viewers, that's a wrap for this Press TV segment of your news review. Thanks for tuning in, and goodbye for now.